Hello, so this is going to be a bit of, I guess, kind of an op-ed, something that I like to do occasionally, but I haven't been doing enough of them recently, so here we go. This one is going to be mostly, surrounding the idea of the current sort of controversies and various things going on in the AAA gaming space, and what I think is actually a good way of potentially thinking about them. The game in the background is Path of Exile. So, I think most people probably already know what's been happening for a while now in terms of the AAA space and all of the whole loot box controversies and all of that nonsense that's been going on. And unfortunately, it actually continues to go on because, well, the main point of this video is the idea that a company is a corporate entity, basically, that needs money to survive. And there's nothing wrong with a company that actually needs money. It's very normal. You can't run a company at a loss, at least not for very long. But this is more speaking to the idea that we've seen this before and how it was actually changed for the better back then, and I think it could be changed in a similar way now, because this isn't the first time that gaming has had large-scale controversies like this involving publishers, corporations, causing problems, and eventually getting to a state where they not just necessarily back down, but actually alter their ways, and it's basically better for everyone. It's better for them, for us, for the whole industry. Better for just the gaming scene in general. Now, back when this kind of really started, I wasn't, I suppose, super affected by it because I often didn't play any of the games that were affected by this, and that's not really a good reason to, not talk about it yet, but I definitely did care. I just didn't know exactly what to say, because there were a lot of other people covering it that basically already had my thoughts kind of panned out, and I didn't really feel the need to add anything more just to be another voice in the crowd. But I'm not the kind of person that likes to complain about something unless I also offer some kind of solution at the same time, or at least a path towards a solution that could actually have us all come out on the other side maybe a little bit better. And it does just seem to be continually cropping up. I mean, for instance, Devil May Cry 5 also had that announcement just recently that a lot of people were not super excited about, and I was very much in that group, because Devil May Cry is a series that I really, really have enjoyed since the very beginning, and seeing it get the idea of, you can pay for red orbs and the like was annoying. We saw that in Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition as well, but you could say that that game was already complete, by the time that that was added, so it couldn't do any damage to the balance of the game. And however, this time it's being added while the game is in development, so we have no idea whether or not it's actually going to negatively affect the progression and general experience of the game or not. And I don't really know either way. I'm not going to make a guess, because honestly, I sort of think that it won't affect it that badly, but the problem is I shouldn't have to worry. I shouldn't have to tone down my excitement for a game and a franchise that I really, really love just because of another inclusion of things like this that push us back a little bit and make us hesitant, which is annoying. You shouldn't have to worry about the things you really like getting ruined by greed. And that's when I kind of started to think about this in a bit of a different way. The idea that we've seen this before, twice actually, in bigger ways that I can think of. The first one being very important in the idea of the free-to-play gaming space. Because really, when you look back at the history of gaming, free-to-play was not always as accepted and large as it is now. Right now, free-to-play is one of the most popular ways to actually sell, in quotations, a game. There are tons of very popular, very successful free-to-play games. Just look on the Steam free-to-play list, for instance. You'll see ads for them everywhere, and you'll just see people enjoying them a lot, because it's a really successful model now. However, this wasn't always the case. I actually remember, back when free-to-play first sort of came to the West in a large way, it was talked about in a very similar way that things like loot boxes and microtransactions in AAA games and things are talked about now. It was not widely accepted, and it was generally seen as a very exploitative, very consumer-unfriendly model of actually selling a game, and people just wanted to stick to the AAAs that they know if they paid the full price, they would get the full game all at once. Wasn't that a good time? But as you can very much tell now, that's no longer the case. There are still plenty of examples of free-to-play games that have really unfortunate monetization models and are just not that great to play because of that, unless you want to put in a bunch of money. But that's less of the rule and more the exception nowadays. There are plenty of very fair ones. So if we go back to really as early or as late, I suppose, as around 2011, 2012, but then back from that further still, you saw the idea of a very different style of game coming to the West. Because free-to-play didn't start here. It started in the Asian markets, where they have a very different, or at least had often, a very different approach to social gaming. The idea of like gaming cafes and things like that being very popular there, people spending small amounts of money, but potentially being willing to spend, or small amounts of time, sorry, but potentially being able to spend large amounts of money in that time in order to get as much progress as possible. And that whole culture was very different from what we had over here in the West at the time, and still is today for the most part, although people like that still exist, and the industry calls them whales, which is unfortunate, but whatever. You had games that were very often based on the model of being very grindy, very difficult to progress in, very time-consuming, unless you put in some money to fix it. And even then, it was often still quite time-consuming. Some very exploitative techniques, such as making sure that the early part of the game was very easy, very guided, gave you lots of free stuff, because of course these games are free to try, so you have to actually put a good face forward to get people in the door. And then very suddenly changing to just a massive difficulty curve and being nearly impossible to progress if you just play the game for free. We're talking about things like Korean MMOs at this point. Old school Korean MMOs were often using this model, and the idea was to get people invested and then hit them with a payment and hope that they were sort of addicted enough at that point to actually pay out and continue playing. And it was very successful in the markets like Korea and things like that, where these PC bonds and things exist, and this sort of gaming was encouraged. It's very different than the market that we have over here. So obviously when that idea came to the West, it wasn't met with the same success, and AAA, or free-to-play, was thought of very basically like the mobile market is now. How people see that the mobile gaming market is kind of a joke and filled with some of the worst examples of exploitative business practices in the industry. That's basically how this was thought of back then. You had mechanics like the idea that in order to actually be competitive in the game, either on a PvE or a PvP basis, doesn't really matter, you had to upgrade your gear. Just, get lots of rare drops and then upgrade them, because just having the armor or the weapon or whatever they gave you wasn't enough. You actually had to give it like a +6 or a +7 upgrade, whatever the mechanic used at the time was. And these upgrades actually had a chance at failure, to where you would have to grind out very difficult to obtain ores and gems and various upgrade materials, and then apply them to upgrading the weapon. However, after the first upgrade being basically a 100% chance at success, every upgrade after that had an exponentially decreasing chance of success, but would still waste the materials whether or not it actually worked or failed. So you would, at the very highest echelons of endgame upgrading, you would have like a 5% chance at success, usually is what it went down to. So you were spending a very long time trying to get these very rare drops of materials for having a 95% chance of failing and having to do it all again. And of course, the other side to this is you can pay for materials instead if you want to. You don't have to go out and grind. You don't have to even have a chance that low. Maybe you can pay for a package that actually increases your chances at success in upgrading your gear. Things like that. This was a very, very common method in things like Korean MMOs of actually getting people to pay. Because you're invested, you have the gear, you spent the time to find it, now you just need to do that last little push forward to make it good enough so you can continue in the game's content upwards. And this was an incredibly common method of keeping people, I suppose, interested while also making them pay out. And that was seen as very exploitative over here when it first came out, and for a good reason, because it is. And now, funnily enough, you actually see, as I mentioned earlier, their mobile gaming market, you see this exact method being put into mobile games now, with lots of very difficult end-game content that you just can't grind out by yourself. You need really highly upgraded gear, but you have a high chance of failure at doing that, so it takes weeks, maybe even months sometimes, of actually trial and error grinding, just bang against a wall until you break through it, or you can pay to do it now. and that was how it was done. So basically, if you looked on Steam and other such services at the time, you saw a huge dichotomy between people buying finished games and actually just sort of avoiding the free-to-play games because it was not really a market that was interesting to the West. So it had to be adapted, it had to be changed, and it had to be added to and subtracted from in various ways that eventually led to the way that it is now, where free-to-play, like I said, is one of the most popular forms of economy for a game that exists. I mean, some of the most popular games in the world are free, and that's obviously a very big difference from how people thought it was going to go back then. So I think that is a really good comparison to how things are now, because we're seeing negativity, we're seeing a very bad health in the scene, things that are making it look worse, making it worse for players, and ultimately, in some cases, making it worse for developers as well, but the publishers are reaping all the benefits. And the way that you change that is to follow the money, because following the money leads you to the realization, as unfortunate that it may be, that corporations, companies, publishers, very large entities, it's not realistic for them to listen to people. There could be millions of followers that have something to say, but they can't listen to what they say. They listen to the numbers, to the bottom line, to the checkbooks, and to the people that actually sort of can steer the industry in different ways. So they listen to each other, basically. And if one publisher is finding large success in doing something, it's very common that another publisher will follow suit. And we saw that with EA, Ubisoft, and all the others basically just sort of encompassing their games within this different system in the AAA space and being often kind of exploitative to people and really just sometimes even ruining the integrity of games altogether, as we saw with things like the Battlefront 2 fiasco. And the thing about all this is it's realistic to say, like I said, that publishers definitely need to listen to where the money is coming from, where it's going, because they have a lot of employees to pay. They're very large at this point. They're far from their humble roots back in the day. Things like Activision used to be a very small company, not anymore. So in other words, when you actually want to voice an opinion to the upper echelons of the industry, to the publishers, the big guys, you can't voice it in the form of words so much as you voice it in the form of money, and not giving them your money. For instance, if you dislike what they're doing, saying that you dislike what they're doing and then buying it anyway just gives them the idea that they're making money, so it doesn't really matter. And that's what we've seen a lot recently. We've seen a lot of people get pretty upset online about these various things, but really they're sort of a vocal minority, and the silent majority are the people that are actually funding this and keeping it profitable for the companies. But, interestingly enough, for the first time, we've seen the companies listening to outcries, to Twitter, to forums, to all this stuff. They're not just loud voices yelling at nothing anymore. The sort of counter to a lot of these ideas has actually gotten large enough online to actually be a blip on their radar. And that means that when all of these people are upset, they have to pay attention to the numbers. These numbers of people are actually a large portion of our user base. And if they all get upset, then that's a lot of lost money. And that's how messages like this have to be conveyed. And I think it's interesting that we're actually at a time now where that has happened officially, with things like, of course, EA backtracking on Battlefront 2. The game was basically destroyed in terms of its progression because of these boxes. And although with the boxes gone, the game didn't really get any better per se, because it was already balanced for them, and with them gone, it was just a grind fest. But the point isn't whether the game was good, it's whether they actually saw their decision as threatened or even threatening to their potential audience and decided to change it. And that's actually a very big step, because, going back to the other example, the exact same thing started to happen in the free-to-play space back when it first came to the West. These games do take quite a bit of money to run. They have a lot of server space, a lot of very high traffic servers to keep up, and that's not cheap. So when they saw people over here, they sort of upgraded their infrastructure to reach here, and then saw that they were, empty almost, and that very few people were actually putting into the system. They knew that it needed to change. The exact same concept, follow the money. If the money isn't flowing in, then how can we fix it? And we've basically gone over a slow period of, a decade or more from free-to-play games that no one wanted to touch for the most part. Like 95% of people just steered clear of them all the time when they came out. They were met with huge amounts of either disdain or very sort of cautious looks, and people didn't necessarily want to just dive in because they knew the feel, they knew the reputation that these games had, to how it is now, like I mentioned earlier, being incredibly popular. So the way that it has been changed for the better for us is things like, look at, say, Dota 2, obviously is one of the most popular games in the world, and it's also one of the most fair free-to-play models out there. Of course, it's not necessarily fair to compare this other games to this, because it's basically a loss leader for Valve, who has like infinite dollars. But the point remains that it is a very good example of a game that is free, gives you a ton of content to play with, and the only things you can pay for are things to make you look different from anyone else. League of Legends was another example that cropped up and showed people that this model can be used effectively and actually fairly and makes sense to people. It has a model where, you can spend money to get things earlier, or you can choose which things you want to get via a limited resource that you earn by playing and only playing. And they actually made it to where it wasn't so grindy and ridiculous that you had to play for just hundreds of hours to get anywhere. You actually earned this currency at a reasonable rate, which was very unlike a lot of the earlier games in the free-to-play space that basically just fed you in a tiny trickle occasionally to keep that dopamine going. And, whether or not you actually like League of Legends or its business model exactly, it's not exactly my thing, but it is a lot better and a lot more fair and a very reasonable business model for a company that has to still make money, but produce something that doesn't exploit its consumer base. And another example, of course, would be Warframe. Warframe is an excellent game that has a crapload of content and a very long development cycle that has seen lots of things added to it, and lots of people very happy about how it actually works. It's incredibly fair. There's tons of choice for everyone to actually choose from. I suppose that goes to the EA idea that player choice is what their boxes were about, which is obviously total nonsense, but that idea doesn't have no merit at all, because if you look at something like Warframe, their transactions are about player choice, actually. You can choose to do or get just about anything in-game in a fairly reasonable period of time, especially if you play a lot and have a lot of other stuff already if you've been in the game for a while. But it's not incredibly grindy. Playing the game is enjoyable and just a normal way of progressing that actually works. Whereas you can pay in order to basically say, I choose to do this right now, and give it to me now. That's basically how it works. And there's nothing really wrong with that. It's a very valid method of actually running a free game. Make sure you have tons of content for the people to actually enjoy, and then while they're enjoying it, offer them some other stuff in between that they, if they want to, can get a little bit faster by paying, or not, it's still available to them. And that is a very impressively well-balanced method of actually doing this. Also, the game in the background, right now, Path of Exile, is another one that's incredibly fair. You cannot pay for any sort of in-game advantage, and everything that you buy is basically just stuff to make you look different. Pets that don't actually do anything, they just follow you around and make you feel all safe, warm inside. And effects for your weapons, new effects for your skills. It's just personalization stuff, as well as, of course, stash tabs, but So it's an incredibly fair model that has garnered them a fairly ridiculous amount of support. If you look in the past through all the various packs they've done, even offering packs that they didn't expect people to buy at first, up to like $500 each, there are dozens and dozens of people with forum avatars that show every single pack that they've actually purchased, and like I said, about several dozen of those at least has just thousands of dollars worth of packs underneath their name, because people like the game. It's a good game, and if you're already enjoying something, you're significantly more likely to actually pay into it to keep going. And that's basically my rule. I've only ever paid into 2 free-to-play games in my life, Warframe and Path of Exile, and my rule is basically, if I like the game, then I don't mind throwing some support their way for producing for free something that I really, really like, and the things that I get in exchange for that are just sort of a bonus. It's just more based on the idea that I'm supporting people that I like, that have made something that I am enjoying, and I don't mind throwing some money their way to do that. Warframe was the same way. Tons of choice, tons of options. Just toss some money in there to say thank you and get a couple things for free, basically, with no in-game time spent on them as a result of that support. And that is probably one of the best feelings. If I'm not enjoying a game, a free-to-play game, if I find that it's a bit too grindy, that I definitely kind of need to spend a little bit, or actually spend time, like a very large amount of time, then I'm probably, I'm not going to pay into it. That's the rule. If I'm not enjoying it, I'm not going to pay to start enjoying it. I have to be enjoying it already. And I think that's a reasonable way to look at them. That has never led me astray so far. And the idea is basically, it changed back then and it can change now. And in fact, one of the other things that we've seen before that very much mirrors this particular, I suppose, outrage was DLC. Things like DLC for Oblivion, the classic horse armor DLC, which was basically the very beginning of the whole DLC sucks mentality. It was terrible. It was money for nothing, effectively, and who knows why it was released exactly for a game that already cost money, but whatever, just moving on. And then, of course, they released Shivering Isles for the same game, which is, in my opinion, one of the best expansions for a game ever made. So you see the dichotomy in one game, in one publisher, and one developer right there. You release something that people think of as a joke and actually use to this day as an example of how DLC can be done poorly, but then you release an expansion that was so good and so well reviewed that people very happily go back to it to this day. One of those people aren't going to pay for and are just going to laugh at you. The other one people are going to be very happy to pay for. And that was the initial problem, very similar to what we talked about earlier with DLC. It was just like the free-to-play sort of mechanics that at first were not looked at with a lot of hope for how they could be better, how they could change, and how they could actually improve the games. And now we have DLC in the form of mini expansions and full-on expansions that actually add a lot to the game. Think of The Witcher 3's DLC, for instance. Those are full-on expansions, and they're both really, really good. Skyrim, if we were going to talk about Bethesda, whether you like the game or not, isn't important. It's the idea that things like Dragonborn and the other one, whose name I can't remember right now, were really good expansions, Dawnguard. And they actually added a lot to the game. They weren't ridiculously overpriced, and they were such a fair amount of content and a good base for particularly more modding that people were happily willing to pay the price for them without complaint because they actually felt they were getting something good for their money. And that very much mirrors the idea that in order to get people to pay into a free-to-play game, you have to give them something worthwhile to actually buy and have them already enjoying themselves. To get people to pay for your DLC, you have to have a very good base that people are willing to keep playing and actually want an addition to. And these things mirror each other to the point where they actually became one and the same. Games like Warframe and Path of Exile actually are free-to-play games with really good expansions, what were essentially like DLC but free, and have added to the game immensely to keep people even more interested and even more invested than before, and maybe even pay for that particular idea, as they still do. So, following those two examples, we have the idea now that what can be done about the current AAA gaming space. It seems to be almost eating itself alive with these very poor ideas and getting a lot of people to be very riled up on forums and stuff like that, and sometimes it actually makes the company notice nowadays. So, since we've seen it all before, I think the space that we're in now is actually given a lot more context and given a lot more, I suppose, value to how it can actually be altered, since we've done it already at least twice. Consumers have the opportunity to actually steer an industry that is veering off course back in its correct direction, because after all, the industry doesn't exist without people to buy the product, and that's us. So if you don't buy the product, then they will continually veer back on course little by little by saying, here's a little bit of concession, here's a little bit of something different to see if the consumer base actually likes it or not. And overall, that's basically all we're asking for. And the more that you can basically show companies that what they're doing is not something that you're willing to pay out for, the more they will steer in the opposite direction to try and get those numbers going back in the black, back in the positive direction. And although it can be difficult and frustrating at times because the internet's majority opinion doesn't necessarily match the silent majority's opinion when it comes to mainstream gaming and things like that, more and more we're actually seeing that those two groups are conflictingly sized. They actually even have a lot of overlap nowadays because people are getting educated on the issues and people are actually wanting to see a change because the things that they've enjoyed for so long are actually being devalued and really compromised by these systems. So I think now that we've seen companies actually even say things like, this game doesn't have loot boxes in it, come to our game. The thing that we're making now, before anyone even asks, we're going to put out a press announcement that says no microtransactions in this game. When we see announcements like that, we see that the industry as a whole very much already understands what's wrong with this. And the only thing left is the very large people that can still profit. So if you're able to take that away a little bit, they will join the rest of us and actually give us back a bit of a semblance of some fortitude in very long single-player games that don't have microtransactions to destroy the economies of it and actually make it incredibly grindy if you don't pay and things like that. Not every game with these systems is actually affected like that. It just makes people worry that they might be when they see a game that will have it in there. And, just like I mentioned earlier, these examples aren't, well, they're generalizations. They aren't cut and dry for everything. There are still plenty of free-to-play games that have terrible in-game ideas that actually really drive people away, except for the most hardcore of spenders. There are DLCs that are still really bad and not worth your money at all. And there are plenty of AAA games like, say, Spider-Man that just released, or Monster Hunter and things like that, that don't have a compromised in-game state due to things like microtransactions and loot boxes. So what it really comes down to is think before you buy, I suppose. Take the idea in your mind that we've actually done this before successfully, and don't think of it as an inevitability that things will just keep getting worse. Think of it more as this is just, a kid with his parents' credit card just seeing how much he can do before the parent notices. And you need to notice. Every one of us needs to notice and actually send the message that this is something that needs to change, because we can change, and we have before. So at least that's how I like to view the idea, and I suppose it may be a bit of an overly optimistic way to view it, but I think it is at least a valuable lesson based on how things of this vein have actually happened in the past. So if you have anything else to say, then definitely leave it down below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.